is a very politically sensitive area of Northeast Asia, or even the entire Asian continent. Asia is a very large place and Taiwan is so small. So why is it that in modern times, literally anything that occurs or could occur within this small island can be felt across the entire continent, across all political spectrums, cultural spheres, and even national borders? The forgotten history. Despite the fact that the island of Taiwan is separated from the mainland of Southeast China, the actual history of Taiwan isn't documented until at least the very earliest, the 1600s. Prior to that is mostly circumstantial evidence of history of the peoples on the island. Communications across the strait, at which were essentially legends and stories. The first real evidence of humans in Taiwan are from the Neolithic era of human history, which was roughly 4,000 years to 3,000 years before the Common Era. This culture of evidence is at the northernmost tip of Taiwan, and evidence further hazard that the culture was that of the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. The indigenous peoples of Taiwan were extraordinarily interesting due to the fact that before any real contact with the Han Chinese, which are the dominant culture of China, the Taiwanese were almost completely different, from spoken language to the culture they used and even their own appearances. According to evidence and actual theories of professionals within Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and even the South Pacific, the aboriginal peoples of Taiwan had more in common with the peoples of the South Pacific Islands in that far region of the world rather than that of China or even Southeast Asia, which was geographically close by. But due to the contact with the Han Chinese, the true culture of the Taiwanese native peoples were permanently destroyed, with high levels of xenocentric assimilation through the hundreds of years of contact that they had. Ancient Chinese dynastic records had also regional dynasties along the southern coast of China, knowing that the island of Taiwan was there, and that there were aboriginal peoples living there, with various types of technology and culture and even contact, but there were scattered attempts at Chinese integration of Taiwan prior to the 1600s. But with mainland China being with its tumultuous history, the concept of colonizing, occupying, or integrating Taiwan was just ignored. Controlling the mainland of China itself was far more important than controlling the tiny island of Taiwan, and in modern times, this ancient attitude of neglect would be a focal point of contention for a whole number of parties involved in both China and abroad. The denied history. From the time of European exploration, Dutch and Spanish interests had small holdings on the island which were originally larger aspirations of controlling the entire island. The Dutch in particular had a vested interest in controlling the island. The Dutch's territory was much larger than that of the Spanish claims, and their name for the island was used for hundreds of years. Formosa. While the Spanish had smaller holdings in the north of the island, nothing much further came of it. The Ming Dynasty was the first dynasty to truly focus on an attempt to control, colonize, and formally incorporate the island of Taiwan into the Chinese sphere of influence. However, the Ming Dynasty at the time had other focuses and largely let the Dutch and Spanish fight among each other upon the island. Once the Ming Dynasty collapsed to the Qing Dynasty and Manchurian rule, former forces loyal to the Ming fled to Taiwan. These residual Chinese dynastic forces forced out the Dutch and Spanish interests permanently. From the late 1600s, Taiwan would be under the claim of the Qing Dynasty, but due to the aboriginal peoples still not being fully subdued by the Ming Dynasty, as well as the Dutch and Spanish not being able to fully control them as well, and lack of development on the island in terms of structures and integration, and even resistance to the later Qing Dynasty, there were more than 100 rebellions by various groups on the island during the early years of Qing Dynasty administration and control. The island was so unstable that there was in all actuality barely any Chinese control of Taiwan. True focus of the Qing dynasty did not occur until the mid to late 1800s. The Qing had three main policies with Taiwan and the situations there. Firstly, control the amount of Han Chinese emigrating to the island. The imperial government didn't want too much ethnically Chinese on the island in case of some sort of incident were to occur island-wide. Secondly, the Chinese that were there weren't allowed into the mountainous regions of the island, as it was underdeveloped when compared to the rest of mainland China at the time, and under the firm control of the Taiwanese Aboriginals. Thirdly, the Chinese immigrants and Aboriginal people would be taxed differently, natives more, Chinese less. The entire tax situation with Han immigrants and Taiwanese natives were viewed as extraordinarily corrupt, as the situation against the natives were abusive. Despite the proposed limits on Han emigration to Taiwan, the neighboring Fujian province was crowded and the demand for land in Taiwan was high among the people. Prior to this time, there were roughly 100,000 Han Chinese in all of Taiwan, and later the population exploded to slightly more than 2,500,000. Due to the high immigration rate of Han Chinese to Taiwan, most of these people emigrating were in fact men, and since there were not much Han Chinese women to marry in Taiwan, the Han men married local Aboriginal women. As a result, the first Han Chinese Taiwanese Aboriginal populations within Taiwan traces its origins to this time period, as well as the first concept of a uniquely Taiwanese sense of identity which would be separate from mainland Han Chinese identity, which would become a focal point of contention in modern times. The Censored History. By the late 1800s, the Imperial Qing government had become so corrupt that even Western powers had active influence over Chinese lands, and even to an extent influenced the governance of mainland China itself. Japan sought to become a modernized and developed nation to avoid what was happening to nearly every incumbent nation in Asia: colonization. To avoid being colonized, Japan sought to do what it had attempted to do in the 1500s, to seize lands overseas to help modernize Japan itself and to spread its influence to avoid foreign meddling in its own affairs domestically. Defeating Imperial Chinese forces in 1895, Taiwan would be ceded from China to Japan. When the Japanese formally obtained control of Taiwan, about half of the island was under the former administration of the Qing. Even in the late 1800s, the Chinese hadn't fully incorporated Taiwan into Han Chinese rule. After centuries of attempting to do so, the Imperial Japanese government actually tried the British method of rule, where the locals would be allowed to do somewhat or most of what they wanted, while ultimate authority resided within Japan, in the officials that were sent to Taiwan to govern it. For the first few decades, the Japanese allowed much of Taiwan to remain as it had been under Chinese governance, or even letting the peoples do most of what they wanted in terms of a local government. The Imperial Japanese interests knew that to force Taiwan to submit quickly wouldn't work, as it hadn't worked for the Chinese for centuries. Early on in its rule, it allowed those living to accept their status as Japanese subjects, or to leave Taiwan to be sent back to mainland China. This was done somewhat to weed out dissent against possible Japanese rule. Some would leave, and some would stay, when faced with this decision in Taiwan. The Japanese also didn't believe that the Aboriginal people of Taiwan could be fully incorporated into Japanese governance, or even Japanese assimilation to Japanese culture, as there was proof that even after centuries of Chinese partial assimilation, a good amount of the Aboriginals in Taiwan still mostly adhered to their own customs and beliefs. The Japanese considered them to be inferior genetically, owing to the mindset of European colonialism at the time, even culturally and historically to the Chinese that remained on the island and largely left them isolated from society, while the Chinese that remained on Taiwan after the declaration slowly began to accept Japanese governance. The Japanese gradually increased the amounts of assimilation of Taiwan into the Japanese sphere of culture, governance, and society. The Japanese actually laid the groundwork literally for much of the rail and infrastructure of modern Taiwan that had been lacking from the Imperial Chinese governments that had so-called claim to the island. Even in modern times, In some of the more distant parts of Taiwan, Japanese infrastructure is still being used. The Japanese also gave the public view of caring for the Taiwanese Chinese mixed people that remained, but it was mostly to foster loyalty to the Japanese government and nation, due to the fact that the people of Taiwan had never technically fostered any loyalty to any foreign power, not the Dutch, Spanish, or Chinese that had come before them in terms of governance. Taiwanese aboriginals who had in fact pledged loyalty or allegiance to Japan actually enlisted in the Japanese army to fight against the nationalists and communists in mainland China. Chinese whom had remained in Taiwan were also loyal to Japan. When Japan was defeated militarily in 1945 by the United States and Chinese forces, there were actually much examples of resistance to the news that in Taiwan it would be given back to mainland Chinese rule. Besides the fact that Taiwan had been neglected for centuries by Chinese leadership and expected more of the same when it was made official that it would return to Chinese administration. For decades after the actual transfer of power back to Chinese control, the people living in Taiwan whom had remembered Japanese rule actually considered it a somewhat good time to be in Taiwan. After the Second World War and the nationalists were defeated by the communists, they fled to Taiwan. They were successfully able to go to Taiwan due in part to the island not having much nationalists or communist forces within the island. It was neglected due to the Japanese fighting against the combined Chinese and United States forces within the mainland of China. Due to the shocking defeat of the nationalists and retreat of the government from the mainland to Taiwan, and the fact that all of mainland China was now communist, the outcry from the international community was swift. The government in Taiwan was considered the official government in exile of China, and the mainland government was considered illegitimate. Within Taiwan, the situation was unstable for decades due to the problems left by the Imperial Chinese governments and neglect from the Japanese colonizers. The political situation in Taiwan was, although Taiwan was a quote-unquote democracy in title or administration, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, kept strict control over the country until the late 1980s. The social situation was not much better, with the fact that with the influx of nationalist soldiers and citizens fleeing communist control from the Chinese mainland, that it held the Chinese mixed group of people whom had already lived there for decades or even centuries were treated differently. Those who were already there were considered outdated vestiges of the Imperial Chinese dynastic governments or the foreign Dutch or Spanish forces, or even Japanese collaborators. The Japanese had been somewhat free with the residents of Taiwan, and the nationalists had to reimpose strict Chinese cultural customs and attitudes once more for the people island-wide, and the notion of what was a Taiwanese person soon began to emerge out of reaction to these reinforced cultural attitudes from mainland China. Due to the history of Taiwan and Chinese mixing with the Aboriginal people, what it was to be Taiwanese was first conclusively discussed in the 1960s and 1970s, from what had happened decades or even centuries prior. Those growing up in Taiwan at the time were either of mixed heritage or Han Chinese, or Aboriginal or ethnic Chinese that had been born on the islands after fleeing the Second World War. So the connection to the mainland was not necessarily there. This connected to the anger internationally, with various governments worldwide switching diplomatic recognition to the Chinese mainland in the 1970s, due in part originally to the lack of worker rights on the mainland and the promise of cheap Chinese goods for international business corporations. At first, the switch of international recognition was simple because of trade and common sense. The small island of Taiwan representing politically, geographically, all of mainland China? For decades it was a fact. After 1945, Taiwan was recognized as the legitimate government of China, but it wasn't until the 1970s that the mainland of China could not be ignored, even if it was a communist method of government. In modern times, the situation with Taiwan is that the Chinese mainland is increasingly alienating Taiwan internationally, so only a small number of nations recognize it internationally, officially. Unofficially, will governments still keep relations with Taiwan? WikiLeaks documents have even suggested that Taiwan is secretly under United States administration, and the fact that there is intelligence network put in the island by the American government from after the Second World War to monitor the communist communications and even situation on the mainland government. Instead of reunification with the mainland due to centuries of only partial integration within or by the Chinese state, be it dynastically, nationalist government or communist regime, there's increasing feelings on the island for an independent Taiwan, be Taiwan independence or reintegration by peace or force with the mainland of China. What will happen with Taiwan could be any sort of scenario.